Good day and welcome to this, the fourth in a series of videos on the English Reformation as it occurred in England during the 16th century. My name is Ross Hebb. If you remember, last session we ended with the death of Edward VI, and at his death, his half-sister, Queen Mary, inherited the throne. And Mary was a very sad creature in certain ways. She was, of course, the daughter of Queen Catherine, and for the last 20 years of her life, she had lived in internal exile within England, out in the countryside and in seclusion. She had, at the age of 16, been declared illegitimate, the illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII, and had lived in seclusion all those succeeding years. And now, all of a sudden, with the death of her half-brother Edward, she was Queen of England. And when she first came to the throne, she was greeted with a great deal of enthusiasm, because the English people were glad to have another Tudor on the throne. But things were to change with the passage of time. She was of the old faith, even more so than her father. And what Mary did during her reign was an attempt to turn back the clock and turn it back completely, not just all the religious changes and practices and in faith that occurred during Edward's reign, but even on doing the jurisdictional changes that happened during the reign of her father. Now, amongst those changes, I must emphasize that some of the Protestant changes that are reflected in the Book of the Common Prayer include two major categories having to do with prayer and belief. One is, of course, prayer to the saints. The Reformers phased those out, including prayers to the Blessed Virgin. So those, you may realize, in the Book of Common Prayer are not present. The other thing which was phased out by the Reformers during the reign of Edward was prayers for the dead. This had been a major feature of late medieval Christian practice and had many abuses associated with it, and it too was something that was phased out completely during the reign of King Edward VI. But Mary was bringing these things and many more back. Amongst some of the things that she did initially was that she removed the English Bible from all parish churches. She removed, of course, the Book of Common Prayer, which was only a few years old, from all parish churches, brought back the Latin Mass in all parish churches, and also demanded that the clergy put away their wives, and in some instances their children as well. She was against married clergy. And so, with all these changes and the need to turn back the clock, approximately 20% of the clergy in the realm of England were put out of their livings and lost their jobs. And so that was one major result of the return of Mary, of the coming of Mary to the throne, and the returning back of the clock in an attempt to go back to the old faith. The other thing that Mary did was pass a succession of acts through Parliament to undo all the jurisdictional changes that had been brought about during the time of her father, Henry VIII. And so the English Church now again came under the jurisdictional area of the Bishop of Rome and of the Pope. And as part of that package, the Pope sent an Englishman back to England as a cardinal, and his name was Reginald Pole. So just like Archbishop Wolsey in the early days of Henry VIII, who Henry sacked as a result of him not being able to secure the divorce, at this point, Mary brought back another cardinal from the Pope, from Rome, with the jurisdiction similar to that which Wolsey had. Effectively, the jurisdiction of the Pope by an Englishman in the realm of England. Now, these were significant changes and a significant turning back of the clock in and of itself. Everything was undone except for one crucial thing. The restoration of the monasteries was not possible because, as I explained earlier on, the wealth of the monasteries had gone to the crown and been spent. The wealth of the monasteries, in some cases, the land had been sold, and the monasteries had been completely despoiled, including local people taking the tiles off the roof of the buildings. So it was impossible to undo all of that because that had happened almost 20 years previously and things had been scattered in more ways than one, and the people who benefited from the wealth did not want to give it up, including the nobles and the business class and the members of Parliament. Now, finally, in 1554, Mary made a profound mistake. She introduced a marriage treaty with the Kingdom of Spain, and she was going to marry Prince Philip of Spain. This was highly unpopular in the English nation. They didn't like foreign entanglements, and they most certainly didn't want to have a foreigner as a king, which would draw them in all sorts of European conflicts, which is precisely what it did, because in a few years' time, they, because of the Spanish allegiance, were at war with France, and that war went very poorly for the English. Not surprisingly, all these changes, particularly the religious changes, met with opposition. The reform movement in England had been in existence since the late years of Henry VIII. Things had moved very quickly during the time of Edward, and many men, bishops, archbishops, clergy, and laity had embraced the reform movement, and some had become varying degrees on the spectrum of Protestantism. And included amongst those were bishops as well as parish clergy. And Mary at first tried to convince people to embrace the old faith, and then when they didn't embrace it, she tried to enforce it. And when they didn't go under the suggestion of enforcement, they were tried and they were jailed, and in instances they were executed. Now, sadly, the method of execution was that for heretics, which meant burning at the stake. And this included several bishops. In April of 1554, two prominent bishops were arrested, Bishop Latimer and Bishop Ridley, and also the then Archbishop of Canterbury, the compiler of the Book of Common Prayer, Thomas Cranmer, was also arrested and jailed. The two bishops were taken, Latimer and Ridley, were taken to Oxford, and there they were debated, there they were tried, there they were excommunicated, and then they were executed by being burnt at the stake. And this is the gruesome business that has earned Queen Mary the reputation of Bloody Queen Mary. And there is, very interestingly, powerful written accounts, eyewitness accounts of many of these martyrdoms, people being put to death for their understanding of the Christian faith, recorded in a book known as Fox's Book of Martyrs. Fox's Book of Martyrs. It would be published in the future. It would be a very thick book and a very popular book, and would go through republication for the following number of centuries. The story of how these people met their deaths, and especially of how these two bishops, Latimer and Ridley, met their deaths being burnt at the stake in Oxford in the year 1555. They were led out to the stake. They were wrapped to the stake on top of a large pile of firewood by chains, and the end of the chains were nailed fast, and then they spoke one to the other. It says in the Book of Martyrs, Ridley spoke to Latimer, said, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." And then the fire was given to them. And Ridley, as the flames came up, cried out with a wonderful voice, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. Lord, receive my spirit." And then later, Master Latimer crying vehemently on the other side, "Father of heaven, receive my soul." And after he had stroked his face with his hands, and as it were bathed them a little in the fire, Latimer soon died. But Ridley lingered longer by reason of the badness of the flame, which only burned beneath, being kept down by too much wood on the fire. Finally, one of the standers-by with a long pole pulled off the wood that was on the top, and when Ridley saw the flame leap up, he leaned himself to that side, and then the flame touched the bag of gunpowder that had been given to him, and when it exploded, he was seen to stir no more. Such are the gruesome details of the martyrdom of Bishops Latimer and Ridley in Oxford due to their adherence to the new Reformed faith, and such is the story that garnered Queen Mary the epitaph Bloody Queen Mary. Now finally, there's the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Even Queen Mary herself was hesitant to burn or to execute an Archbishop of Canterbury, and there was a great deal of pressure over the course of months while he was in prison placed upon Archbishop Cranmer to change his mind. And in the end, he did grant a partial recantation. The man was 65 years of age, being considered very elderly at that point in history. His life's work was behind him, and he had an extremely difficult choice. He could recant and embrace something which he didn't now believe in and live a long, comfortable life in retirement, or he could stand for what had become very clearly his beliefs and his principles and face torture and a miserable, torturous death. And in the end, he chose the latter. And he was divided, of course, also between loyalty to his queen, who was Mary now, and loyalty to his conscience and to what he understood as the truth. In the end, he opted for the truth. And, of course, in Fox's Book of Martyrs, we have a detailed account of his martyrdom. On his way to the stake, this is in Oxford, and you can still see the burn marks on the door of the buildings in Oxford University where this took place. On his way to the stake, when he came to the place where the holy bishops and martyrs, Latimer and Ridley, had been executed, there he kneeled down and prayed. But he didn't tarry long in his prayers. He put off his garments to his shirt and prepared himself for death. His shirt was made long down to his feet, which were bare, and his head was so bare that one hair could not be seen upon it. His beard was long and thick, covering his face with marvelous gravity. Such a countenance of gravity moved the hearts of both friends and foe. Then an iron chain was tied about Cranmer, fixing him to the stake, and when they perceived him to be more steadfast than to be moved from his sentence, they commanded the fire to be set at his feet. And when the wood was kindled, and the fire began to burn near him, stretching out his arm, he put his right hand into the flame, the hand which had signed the partial recantation, which he held so steadfast and immovable that all men might see his hand burn before his body was touched. His body did so abide the burning flame with such constancy and steadfastness that, standing always in one place, without moving his body, he seemed to move no more than the stake to which he was bound. His eyes were lifted up to heaven, and oft times he repeated this unworthy right hand, so long as his voice would allow it, and using often the words of St. Stephen, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit, in the greatness of the flame, he gave up the ghost. And that's the record in Fox's Book of Martyrs of the death of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, faithful servant of Henry VIII, compiler of the Book of Common Prayer, and someone who stood for an English Bible, services in English, and married clergy, indeed quite a heritage which lies as part of our Reformation story in England in the 16th century. Things would soon come to an end, because in the year 1558, and November the 17th, Queen Mary passed away, and she passed away alone. She thought she had been bearing a child, but it turned out most likely to have been advanced stomach cancer. Her husband, King Philip, had left her and gone back to Spain, and so she died alone in November of 1558. And interestingly and amazingly, our Cardinal Pole, the Roman delegate from Rome and representative of the Pope, died just a few hours after her. So both the Queen and the Papal Legate, both the Queen who was turning back the clock and the man who came from Rome to help accomplish that, both passed away on the same day. And it is said that there was celebration in England, in London, on that day, because this bloody episode of English history, which left an irreparable mark on the English mind and reputation and conscience, had finally come to an end. And then there would be a new beginning with Mary's half-sister, Princess Elizabeth. But that's a story for another day and for next week. Thank you, and good day.